I want to thank the Bourne Library for the invitation to speak, and IRIA in particular for putting things together. So I'm here to talk about my book, This Land of Snow, A Journey Across the North in Winter, which is published by Mountaineers Books. And it tells the story of a journey I made over the course of a single winter in 2012 and 13 across a pretty large section of northwestern Canada. So I'm going to basically use the images to kind of guide me through the talk. First of all, are any of you skiers?
Used to.
Yeah?
Used to be.
Used to be?
Mm-hmm.
Cross country or downhill?
Both.
Both? Okay. So this is a guy called Tony Matt, who was an Austrian skier who came over to the United States and specifically to New Hampshire, where I'm from, in 1938, just after the Anschluss, Germany's annexation of Austria. And there was a whole raft of Austrian skiers that came over, and many of them were disciples of this ski instructor called Hannes Schneider, who founded a ski school in North Conway, New Hampshire. And one of these guys that came over with him was this guy, Tony Matt, who was a ski racer. And he became famous in the United States, and specifically in New Hampshire, for his role in a 1939 ski race called the American Inferno, which was a race down the slopes of Mount Washington. It only happened 3 times, and Tony Matt was in the third and final edition of this race. So his performance was really remarkable. He managed to ski down, and this is only about the top half of Mount Washington. So that's Tuckerman Ravine in the middle of the shot and the summit cone. And then the woods go down another 2,000 feet below that. So the run from top to bottom, the race course is about 4 miles. And Tony Matt managed to ski that distance in about 6.5 minutes. That's okay. 6.5 minutes, in doing so, he about halved the time that it had taken the previous event's winner to cover the distance in. And he's thought to have hit 90 miles an hour coming down the head wall of Tuckerman Ravine. Now, part of the reason this happened is that he had never skied on Mount Washington before. And he miscalculated where the head wall started. And so he'd planned to take a couple of turns going into it to slow down, but he missed the chance, and so ended up just shoosing the head wall and made it down in 6.5 minutes. Now, if any of you have ever climbed Mount Washington, it takes, at a good clip, 4 or 5 hours to go from bottom to top. So you can imagine how fast he was going to cover that distance in 6.5 minutes. Now, I spent a lot of time in this area as a little kid. We skied downhill a lot at Wildcat, and then did a lot of hiking on Mount Washington in the summer. And I had 3 brothers, and we'd often go with my dad. And my dad loves to spin yarns, and so he loved to tell the story of Tony Matt. And he'd always say, Tony Matt came down the mountain, and he came down the Sherburne Trail, and when he got to the Pinkham Notch at Route 16 at the bottom of the mountain, he was so terrified at what he'd just done that he took off his skis, laid them down behind his car, backed out of the parking lot, breaking his wooden skis in half, and drove off and never skied again. And so this story, I always had this story kicking around, and I kind of thought, oh, that's kind of a dramatic response, but I wonder if there's some, if that means something. I don't know, but I didn't think too much about it. So anyway, I started skiing downhill when I was about 5 years old. Here I think I'm a little bit older, but and it was another 5 years or so before I discovered cross-country skiing. Kind of by chance, I found an abandoned pair of old wooden cross-country skis in my parents' cellar, and just started sort of teaching myself. We grew up out in the woods, and there was, lots of space and lots of snow, and so I started doing that. Now, fast forward to early adulthood, just after finishing college, I went to graduate school, and for what I was studying, I needed to learn German. So when I was 23, I went over to Germany to do an intensive language course for about 4 months. And while I was there, I met this woman who's an Italian woman named Elena, who would later become my wife. She's part of the story. And I eventually moved to Italy, and I lived there for many years. And I was working as an English teacher and a part-time translator. So this is the city I lived in Italy. It's called Bergamo. It's in northern Italy. It's right at the foot of the Alps. You can see the Alps just, it's sort of where the plain of the Po River in northern Italy meets the Alps. So maybe you've been there, but if you've ever been to Colorado Springs, it's kind of the same effect. It's like the prairie hits the city, and then there's like this wall of mountains rising behind it. So I lived in Italy for a long time, and after close to 10 years there, something started happening, and so probably 8 years, something started happening inside me. I was profoundly unhappy and really homesick all the time, and I felt like I wasn't living up to what I thought I could or should do in life. But really, the most powerful manifestation of this sort of unease was my homesickness. And so I would spend a lot of time, I looked for opportunities to go into places that kind of reminded me of the wild places that were familiar from my childhood. And so I'd go off into the Alps and look for these places, but it never felt like home to me. And I started to sort of take this very negative view of where I was, and I just really wasn't happy with Italy. And so just to give you, this is a sort of an episode from the book, but it dawned on me one day while looking over this little town in the mountains in Italy, not far from Bergamo, that I was convinced that Italians didn't know how to make little villages properly, the way that I thought they should be made. So I thought, Italian villages are they're not qualitatively different from cities. They're like shrunken cities, and so it's like they took a city block and just dropped it into the Alps. Whereas I thought a village, so this is a little village with 300 people in it in Italy, but I thought that a village with 300 people should look like this. A New Hampshire village with 300 people. You don't see that the 300 people are stashed away in the woods somewhere. But anyway, this obviously is problematic, and I can see this in hindsight. By the time I was convinced. And so I just, everything Italian was sort of soured for me. And I just became obsessed with this sort of what I saw as the simplicity of life at home and close contact with nature. And I thought, the Italian, I was getting soft because there was, Italian winters weren't harsh enough for me. And I had images of this is me as a kid, riding my bicycle to my friend's house through the snow. And so one day I was reading, this was in 2011, and at the time I would read National Geographic fairly regularly. And in the spring of 2011, I opened up National Geographic, and there was this fold-out image, one of those three-paneled images that had this guy in it. This is Andrew Skirka, who is actually from Massachusetts. And he's kind of an adventurer, a long-distance hiker, I guess you'd say. And I think the year before, 2010, he did this huge journey around Alaska and the Yukon. It was something like 4,000 miles, and it took him 6 months, I think. And basically, he did this huge circuitous route, partly on skis, partly on foot, and partly using a pack raft. But I saw this image, and I thought that's what I need to be doing. And so from this, it was really like this something clicked, and I started thinking serious about it. And really, like this picture, for example, I figured out what kinds of skis he was using, and I started thinking about this idea of going on some kind of a long-distance ski journey. Now, I'd long wanted to go on a long-distance journey on foot, and so now it occurred to me, I could combine my love of skiing with that ambition of doing a long-distance journey, thanks to this National Geographic picture. So the following winter, I started spending more time than I usually did in the Alps, backcountry skiing. Now, you have to understand, most of this is happening in my head. I wasn't really talking to my wife about this, although she knew that I had wanted to do some kind of a long-distance journey at some point. So before we got married, actually, I said, I want you to say that you won't mind, at some point, before I'm too old, I'd like to go on some kind of a journey. But she thought I meant, the Appalachian Trail or something like that in the summertime. So I spent all this time thinking about it and kind of training, doing, these activities that I thought of as training. But at a certain point, of course, I had to say to my wife, next winter I would like to go and try to ski across something along to spend months outside skiing. I wasn't sure what yet. And so this is in the Alps near Bergamo. That's my little dog who would often join me. His name is Beowulf. Now, in my late teens and early 20s, this guy was kind of a hero of mine. This is Friedrich Nansen, who's the Norwegian polar explorer and later humanitarian. And his sort of first expedition, big expedition that he took, distinguishing himself, was a journey across the Greenland ice cap in 1888. And that was the first time that someone had sort of skied across a huge landmass from one sea to another. And so I had this idea kicking around the back of my head as I started thinking about this. And eventually I hatched this idea. I said, most sort of long-distance winter skiers of necessity do things like polar exploration. They ski to the South Pole or the North Pole or across Greenland because that's where there's consistent snow cover. But that was too extreme for me. I didn't feel qualified, for one thing. But also I was interested in meeting people along the way and learning something about culture in a northern place where there are harsh winters. I also happen to be a dual citizen of Canada and the U.S. My father is Canadian. And so I had to spend a lot of time in the St. Lawrence Valley in particular. But I had this connection to Canada, so I thought I'll try to ski across Canada, which is easy to say when you're sitting in the comfort of your home in Italy. So this was basically the route that I initially planned. It's almost 3,000 miles from the Pacific. I was going to start in the west and go east. Now, as it happened, it was a bit different. But this is the map I had in my mind when I set off in November of 2012. And so, it was about 14 months between when I announced to my wife that I planned on doing this without really talking to her about it, and then it happened. And so there was a lot of domestic drama between when I had that picture of Canada in my head and then the Vancouver bus station with all my stuff. We were sort of on the cusp of a divorce at this point. My wife was extremely unhappy with me. She tried to dissuade me, to persuade me to get someone to come along with me, which I was unwilling to do. But also, I did briefly try to find someone, but trying to persuade someone that it's a good idea to spend 4 months outside in northern Canada is not easy. So I landed in Vancouver, and my plan was from here to take a boat across to Vancouver Island and then take a bus up the length of Vancouver Island, which is about a 1 day's journey. And then from there take a boat that goes up the Inside Passage along the British Columbia coast to Alaska. And I was going to get off in a town called Prince Rupert, which is Canada's northwesternmost port. And I'll show you a map in a few minutes. Prince Rupert is Canada's northwesternmost Pacific port. So it's basically just a few miles south of the southern part of the Alaska Panhandle. So that's where I was going to start, and then I was going to go east, basically following the 55th parallel. I wanted to stay in the boreal forest, because that's kind of a belt where there's heavy snowfall and where the snow tends to stick around. Farther north in the tundra, the snow tends to get blown off. It's windy all the time. It's not a pleasant place to ski. So that was kind of this area that Canadians call the near north. That's what I was interested in seeing and spending a winter traveling across. So I took the boat up the Inside Passage. This is me on the deck looking towards the mainland. There are all sorts, thousands and thousands of islands off to the west. And this isn't a very good picture, but you just see all those little white streaks coming down are waterfall. Most of them are waterfalls. And the bioregionalists call the area between Northern California and the Yukon Cascadia, and there's the Cascade Range, but we seldom think about what it means, but it really means land of waterfalls, right? And so here you get that impression. There's just water sort of cycling down mountains, up into the water, up through the atmosphere, and then back down. And it's cloudy most of the time. But as I was coming to Prince Rupert, the sun came out, and it was really a radiant kind of day. I spent a lot of time scribbling on my way up. This is me sitting in the boat and this is what I did a lot of whenever I had downtime, because I knew I wanted to write about this. So when I got to Prince Rupert, I didn't expect there to be snow, and in fact there was very little because it's northwestern climate, and so you have to get inland about 60 miles before you really get to low altitude snow. So in Prince Rupert, I arranged to have my sled and my skis and a few other things freighted ahead to Terrace, which is the first inland town, about 90 miles inland, and then I walked carrying the rest of my stuff. Mostly at that point, it was in the Skeena River Valley, so I mostly was just walking along the road. There's just a single asphalt strip. It's really the only way, because it's a very narrow valley. When I got to Terrace, I checked into a motel. I realized I had way too much stuff. And so this is a picture of me consolidating my stuff. Fortunately, I did that because it really was too much. So this is where I really started skiing. There's a valley that comes down into the Skeena. It's called the Copper River Valley, and that's where the town of Terrace sits. And I was going to ski up that valley and go over a pass called Telco Pass. Now this was the physically most demanding part of the journey. It was crossing a pretty significant mountain range. And so this is the first part. You can see it's very damp. There's all this sort of fog floating up off the snow, and it was relatively warm still. This is me skiing up that section. I'll kind of race through a few of these to carry this forward. I was skiing uphill for about 4 or 5 days, and it was like going up a very gradual staircase up from the Pacific, basically, getting into this sort of world of winter and big mountains. Now, for those of you who are, well, maybe you know or maybe you don't, but a lot of people who aren't skiers say, how were you skiing uphill? And so my skis had climbing skins on them. And so these are these things that you put on the bottom of your skis. It's a kind of fabric that has a nap that lies diagonally so that you can slide in one direction. But if your skis go backwards, let's say, the fabric grips into the snow so that you don't slide backwards. So you can ski uphill and even haul a load uphill. So that picture's there just to show you what the bottom of my skis looked like. So here, this is close to this pass called Telco Pass in a group of mountains, part of the coast mountains of British Columbia, called the Howson Ranges. There was kind of a blizzard up high as I passed underneath. Underneath these mountains. I narrowly missed this powder avalanche, which slid about 10 minutes ahead of me. In a way, it was a good thing because it was, the slope had already discharged when I passed under it. But still, it was kind of scary to see this. I whipped out my camera. It took me a minute to get it out, but you can still see the powder settling. Like the whole side of that mountain basically slid off. Incidentally, I had to camp not far from the base of that slope because it got dark very quickly, and that was sort of the first instance of fear and almost a kind of regret. Like I really missed my wife for the first time, even though things were very much on the rocks at that point. And after getting through that pass, it took me about a week to get over that section of mountains, and it was very remote. I didn't see any other human beings. I didn't see an electric light, and so when I came back down, I came into this little village called Telqua, and it was cold, and I had gotten wet because the days were still relatively warm, so I'd get wet in the daytime and then freeze at night. And I decided once I got to the first road, I was going to hitchhike into the next town, which was a bigger place called Smithers. So I got there late at night, probably 10 at night, which seems very late when it gets dark at 3 o'clock, and started hitchhiking. Stuck out my thumb and waited. There were very few cars. The first car that came stopped, and it was a young woman about my age whose name turned out to be Mika, and she said she and her husband had a trailer outside their house that had a space heater in it, and that I was welcome to spend the night there rather than hitchhike to a motel. So I took her up on the invitation. And at this point, I want to, it was hard to express how excited I was to see other people at this point. So I want to read a little passage that touches on that and gives some context for how I was feeling at that point. So she brought me back to her. She was just coming home from work late at night, and her husband was waiting for her at home, and they lived in this cabin out in the woods, you know, no other neighbors around, back on this gravel road, which was of course covered in snow. So Mika and I pull into the driveway, and I start unloading my stuff. When we stopped, I started to unload. While Mika ran upstairs to tell her husband she'd dragged home a strange man. Next thing I knew, I heard a furious thumping on the stairs, and the husband charged through the outside door. He ran at me in the dark and grabbed my hand with both of his and pumped it excitedly. "Holy shit, man! Holy shit! Are you fucking crazy?" I didn't know how to respond to such enthusiasm. It was a yes or no question, but a simple yes or no would not suffice. No, I'm in full possession of my senses, or yes, I am, in fact, although the preferred term is mentally ill. Perhaps it was my difficulty producing a response that made him apologize for swearing. "I'm sorry, dude. I hope I didn't offend you. My name's Nick." "I'm Anders," I said, "and you didn't offend me." "I don't really think you're crazy," he said. It's so cool that you're here. I've honestly been waiting for something like this to happen." He told me that a few years before, a long-distance cyclist traveling from Alaska to Patagonia had passed through. Mika had met him in Smithers, but she hadn't thought to invite him home. Nick had regretted it ever since and told her to invite all such stragglers home with her in the future. He loved to collect stories, and such people had them to tell. At last she'd reeled one in. Nick went out to the trailer to turn on a space heater while I spread my tent and clothes around the wood stove in the walkout basement. I'm going to skip ahead a bit here. So we go upstairs and have something to eat, and then Mika goes off to put the kids to bed. And Nick says to me, "I see a ring on your finger," Nick said. I could never imagine being so forthright as to ask someone that. I admired him for it. "Are you married?" he said. "I am," I said, "but my marriage is on the rocks." It was a formulaic phrase, the kind that colonizes your native language when you're more used to speaking another, and it sounded that way as soon as it left my mouth. "On the rocks" was a perfectly natural idiom, of course, but in this instance the words were marked because they brought me back to a specific place and time. Elena and I had happened to be sitting on some literal Mediterranean rocks the summer before when she encountered the phrase in a novel she was reading and asked me what it meant. "It means someone is going through a marital crisis," I said. "Are we on the rocks?" she said, half joking. "Yes," I said, and she turned very sad. I'd never understood the phrase to denote total ruin, but now that I thought about it, the prospects of a ship caught on a shoal are not good. Then Nick and I chit-chat some more, and Nick told me the story that he had been in a long-term relationship. He was about my age. He'd been in a long-term relationship and had got into a skiing accident, interestingly enough, and wound up in a coma. And when he came out of the coma, he realized that his relationship with this woman wasn't working, and eventually met someone new and got married and had a family. And he was convinced that this accident had somehow been subconsciously deliberate. It was a way of sort of forcing him to make a change in his life. This, of course, at the time appealed to me very much. And so Nick eventually takes me out to the trailer. I go to bed. Alone in the trailer, I sat for a moment before stripping down for bed. I thought about the homey lights I had seen as I came down the mountain and how remarkable it was that I had wound up in one of those very homes. I thought about Mika and Nick's kindness and easy generosity. I thought about their smiling faces and their working together, how they'd made a life that gave them time to be with each other and with their kids. I thought about the tiny, breathing bodies of their little ones as they slept in their beds, and about the tender affection with which Nick had looked at them as we passed by when he showed me to the bathroom. I thought about the very design of their house, with no doors separating any of the spaces, so that everything was connected. Not even a door on the bathroom, just a thin curtain. "There's not much privacy," said Nick, "but we don't mind. Hope you don't." I thought about how wonderful all this was and how it seemed an almost perfect embodiment of ideas about life and home that I had fostered for years but had somehow let slip to the back of my mind or be put on hold. And I thought about myself and how I was alone out here, by choice, and how I had someone, but something wasn't working. Was it because our ideals had clashed? Was this Was this journey nature's way of leading me back to what I really wanted from life and back to the half-wild places where I was sure that whatever that was must live? In a process over which I felt I had little control, I was beginning to think that this journey might be a step along the way to a new beginning. I thought about how change is sad, but also about how failure to change when change is called for is sadder still. I thought about the fire of the wood stove. I thought about the warmth inside the trailer. After a quick stretch, I lay down, covered up, and kept on thinking these things, smiling in the darkness until I drifted off. The next day, I spent with Nick and Mika, and we went into town. I needed to buy some supplies and do things like that, and I also needed to call Elena, which is something I wasn't looking forward to. She had persuaded my parents that it would be a good idea for her and the two of them to come out and see me at Christmas, wherever I happened to be. I didn't know where. So they were going to fly to Edmonton, which seemed like it would be the closest, big city, and then kind of drive out and find me. And so we needed to talk about the logistics of this, because it was, at this point, it was early December. On the phone, there was a feeling of irreducible distance between me and Elena. Whenever I had talked to her since my departure, I had a feeling of melancholy. She sensed this, but at the same time, there must now have been a layer of joy in my voice from my having successfully made the first leg of my journey and spent such a wonderful evening. She asked me if I still wanted her to come at Christmas. I evaded the question. I didn't want her to come, not because I thought I wouldn't enjoy her company, but because I'd started to see this journey as a way of forcing distance between us. It would only, if we would only let it, this might be the twist of fate, like the skiing accident Nick had told me about the night before, that steered us down different paths. I wished she would just stay at home, let me go my own way, and time and distance would take care of the rest. I'd never learned to have hard conversations, though. Tell me that you love me and don't love me anymore and I won't come, she said. I would be lying if I told you that, I said. It isn't that simple. It felt as though she was trying to force me to see the world through a lens she'd cut for me. Love had nothing to do with it as far as I was concerned. I said I would work out the Christmas details with my parents and ended the awkward conversation. So this is kind of a secondary theme of the book, this like sort of early midlife crisis that I was going through. And winter becomes kind of a metaphor for understanding it. This is the route that I ended up actually taking. So you can see I only made it about halfway across Canada, not all the way. That's the straight line down the middle of the map is the 55th parallel. So I was more or less kind of straddling, zigzagging back and forth across that. And at the upper left-hand corner, you see Prince Rupert, and then Telco Pass, and then the town of Telco, which is where that bit I just read takes place. So a lot of my skiing in northern British Columbia was done on logging roads. This happens to be a logging road that's in use, but lots of them were unused. So there's a really intricate network of probably tens of thousands of miles of logging roads all through northern British Columbia. And most of them remain unplowed, and they plow the ones that are being used in a given winter where they're taking lumber out or timber out in a given in a given year. And they make very convenient skiing paths, and so I use them. In other places, in Alberta in particular, I would follow railroads. Now, you can't think of like a commuter rail like we have around here, but like these are railroads that cross huge expanses of land that don't have any other kind of, there are no roads for cars. Like the railroad is the only way across, and maybe a train will come by once a day, sometimes not at all. And so they're also pretty good ski trails. But the kind of patchwork nature of my route finding becomes another one of the many themes in the book. I talk a lot about trails and the way that humans move across the land. It spurred a lot of thought. So this is a railroad moving across northwestern Alberta. I would see little things like this, like these mouse tracks, and I would feel envious because I wanted to move across the land, like rather than with all my clunky gear breaking this line across the snow. I wanted to move as elegantly, say, as a mouse here. And at one point I saw a fisher running through the woods, and I felt envious of how gracefully it moved over the land. These little things like that would happen all the time. This is the Peace River Valley. This is one of the most important rivers that I crossed in northern British Columbia. This flows down to the Slave and then the Mackenzie River and eventually into the Arctic Ocean. This is northwestern Alberta. It's kind of like Indiana with snow. Here we're looking, it's very hazy, but we're looking over Lesser Slave Lake in north central Alberta. This is the first big lake that I came to. I skied across 3 really, really sizable lakes and lots of small ones. I like this picture because this is a pretty typical northern small town scene. This is twilight, obviously. And you've got sort of the lopsided telephone poles from the freezing and thawing that happens all the time. These houses that are little better than cabins. Grain elevators started popping up. I was in Alberta. It was at the northern edge of the prairie, kind of straddling this line between prairie and boreal forest. And so I'd see scenes like this that I might not have expected so far north. This is on that lake I just mentioned, Lesser Slave Lake. This is what my camp looked like every night. So I was using a tunnel tent made by a Swedish company. In this shape of tent is really good at resisting a high wind, which was important because I was going to be sleeping on frozen lakes and things like that. So this is what my camp looked like on any given night. Sometimes it was in the woods, sometimes it was on a mountain. But whenever possible, I would follow trails that had been set down by snowmobiles. And particularly when I got into Saskatchewan, there were lots of long distance snow. People actually still use snowmobiles as a means of transportation, of going from one place to another. So you could find like 60-mile sections of snowmobile track, and if you found something like that, it was obviously much better than breaking trail through deep snow. My skis, as you can see over there, had a picture of Roald Amundsen, who's another Norwegian explorer, the first person to reach the South Pole. And he had this sort of stern look, which would urge me on when I got tired or just sick of being out there. I met a lot of people, even though there are not a lot of people in that part of the world. But when I did meet them, they tended to talk to me and be very friendly. This was the home of a guy called Don Skopik, who in the book is called the Cossack. He was a Canadian of Russian origin, who invited me to spend a night at his cabin, which was very primitive, let's say. This was his kitchen. He had one tap in the bathroom. He had one tap of running water, but he just used that that was his only water source. And he did all his cooking here. His pots were there, his silverware was somewhere back in there, stashed away. Let me read a little section about this guy, because he was kind of a character. So I saw him. I was just actually leaving this little town, this little Indian reservation town called Beauval Forks, and it was like a Sunday afternoon, and it was kind of one of those bright days with a low cloud ceiling. There's like this really jarring snow light, and I had a headache, and I was just kind of in a foul mood for whatever reason. and I was just about to leave town. I was near this road, and I saw this guy standing by the edge of the road, staring at. He'd stopped his car, pulled over, and he stepped out of his car and was kind of staring at me. It was a black sedan, and the driver appeared to be waiting for me. When I came closer, he got out and stood watching my approach. He wore a leather jacket and was smoking a cigarette. I skied up to him, even though he looked like he might be a creep. He shook his head slowly and smiled when our eyes met. "I know exactly what you're up to," he said confidently. "I saw you from the road and I knew it. This guy's in it for the long haul," I said. "I've done a lot of this sort of thing myself." I was skeptical. Standing there by the side of the road in his jeans with a cigarette in hand, he hardly looked the part. "I used to mush dogs all through this country," he said. "Come on, let's load your stuff into the car. We'll go back to my place. pull out some maps. You can regroup, and I'll put you and I'll help you put a route together." Which, of course, I'd already done myself. His directness was somehow captivating, and my instincts said he was probably harmless. I didn't hesitate in stuffing my gear into the back of his car, and off we drove with the creaky trunk hatch flopping at each bump in the road. We drove 4 miles back west to Don Skopic's cabin, which he and his sons built from 90 pine logs they felled nearby. The cabin had electric lights, but was otherwise primitive. Don lived alone, and you could tell. His house rules demanded strict parsimony, which he called cheapness. "The toilet's in here," he said, showing me the bathroom, "but if you just have to take a leak, don't flush it, or better yet, go outside. If you do have to flush, just pour the water from here into the toilet." He indicated a 5-gallon bucket under the sink drain. "And make sure you remember to put the bucket back under the sink, because I disconnected the drain pipe. Also, if you decide you need a shower, which you don't, take the bucket with you and try to catch as much water as you can." The kitchen consisted of a wood stove. A few pots, pans, and utensils hung on the wall behind it. Don kept a supply of dry firewood inside the house. He rationed it carefully and was forever studying ways to burn less while still keeping the house tolerably warm. He asked me if I knew any tricks. The floors were littered with books and photographs and contraptions for exercising. There was a large flat-screen TV that had never been hooked up, and everywhere were boxes of rare coins that supplemented Don's pension as a retired high school teacher. Near the boxes were scribbled lists of customer orders and addresses all over Canada and the United States. Don had grown up in Prince Albert, 190 miles southeast of Beauval. As a teenager, exploring the wilderness north of his home and gazing wistfully at maps of the lakes that dot Saskatchewan's north by the thousands, it became his ambition to know the trails of the north better than any other white man, in his words. He moved north and married a native woman from Beauval who bore him 2 sons, but the marriage didn't last. He had a working grasp of Dene and Cree and had spent years exploring the north by dog sled, canoe, and bush plane. Over the last 10 years, however, Don had spent little time in the wild. He'd taken to spending several months a year traveling in Europe, mostly in Ukraine and Russia, where his forebears came from. He signed his correspondence the Cossack and could speak Russian. When he saw me skiing along the side of the road at the edge of the bush, it had reawakened something in him. He seemed to want to connect again to a world he'd once been immersed in. And then I spend a lot of time talking about him. This is me on the trail. You can see that I'm carrying 1 ski pole and 1 birch sapling. I had just come through a terrifying blizzard, the most terrifying experience of my life. I was quite certain I was going to die. I became disoriented on a rather large lake in the middle of this whiteout blizzard that just descended pretty suddenly. Not only that, but the lake was, there was a thick layer of slush underneath the snow, and I ended up getting all my sled and my skis completely covered in slush, and then as soon as they hit the air, they would freeze, so I had these huge blocks of ice. Ended up breaking a ski pole. Anyway, I got through it eventually and had to cut down this little tree to use as a second ski pole. And then here I was coming into a small town at the end of the day where I actually had a contact there, and this is when I met this guy. And he snapped this picture, and I'm not a really smiley person, but here I was extremely happy to see another human being. East of there, we're now into Saskatchewan, and this is the largest lake I crossed. It's called Lac L'Orange. It's an immense lake, probably 50 or 60 miles across. And what you see here is what's called a pressure ridge, and this is when you have 2 huge sheets of ice. Separate sheets that collide. It's kind of like plate tectonics, like these sheets of ice collide and one goes up and one goes down, and you get this thing that forms. It's called a pressure ridge, and they can shoot up 20 feet into the air. This is only 5 or 6 feet high, but these things form, and sometimes there's an opening, like shortly after they form, where there's open water in between the 2 sides of in between the 2 sheets, so they can be dangerous to cross. Sometimes that wasn't the case here, fortunately, but it's one of those interesting things. So this is on that same lake, and you're looking back, and the black strip on the horizon is not the mainland, but an island in the lake, just to give you a sense of scale. It took me I spent part of parts of 3 days on this lake. So I spent 2 nights camped out in the middle of it. This is where I'm about to set up camp. So setting up camp was a pretty involved process. It usually took about 45 minutes just to kind of tamp out a tent platform. Here it was easy because the snow was wind packed, but like when you had 3 or 4 feet of snow, I would have to spend a long time just getting the snow compact to be able to put my tent on it without sinking into the snow. This is me on that lake. Here I am now in Manitoba. It looks like I'm skiing along the New Jersey Turnpike or something with the smokestack in the background, but I'm actually in the middle of nowhere. This is outside a town called Flin Flon, which is it's a tiny town, but it's a major mining center, and so that's the smokestack of the smelter. And this was taken by a local journalist. It's a good picture because you see, kind of what I looked like on any given day. You can see that I'm wearing glacier glasses because there was a lot of glare on the snow, and it can be hard on the eyes. That's another from that same series. Now at the tail end, so there's kind of I don't have time to get into it, but I mentioned that this sort of crumbling of my marriage was a major theme in the book. And it's hard to explain concisely, but it is part of the book. I in retrospect, rather foolishly became involved with another woman. It's hard to become involved with someone in a context like this. It was mostly through correspondence, but and she ended up joining me for a couple of days towards the end of the journey. And then at the tail end, my father, from the very beginning, he'd expressed interest in coming along with me. So he drove out when I knew, I was getting close to the end in March and joined me for a couple of days. And we were skiing in central Manitoba on a network of long-distance snowmobile trails, and I had happened to meet a member of the snowmobile club. It was a really friendly guy called Curtis, extremely friendly Manitoban, and he invited us to spend the last, to have kind of a party. He knew it was going to be the last night of my journey. We'd met, and he was excited about what I'd done. So he said, I'll bring a bunch of my snowmobiling friends out, and we'll meet you at this little warming cabin, and you guys can sleep there. So it was kind of this thing to look forward to. Now, when my dad had arrived, we'd met in this little town called Swan River, where Curtis lived, and he and my dad had kind of hit it off, but they hadn't talked very much. Like I'd been there talking with him, and I went off to the bathroom at one point, and it came back, and they were like buddy already. So it was kind of this funny relationship. The reason I tell you that is because you need to know that to understand this last passage. My dad and I kind of have a funny relationship. We sometimes get along, sometimes don't, but when we're skiing, we usually do. So this is the last night. I'd been skiing for 4 months. My dad took this picture of me at like the afternoon of the day, and so we were in this cabin about 15 miles out in the woods. And so the final morning, we were going to, spend the half day skiing out. So this was kind of my celebratory last picture. I'll come back to that in a minute. And so what seemed like the middle of the night, all these snowmobilers descend upon us in our little cabin, and they're pulling all this hot food out of coolers and putting it on the wood stove. And it's like this big celebratory affair. So this Curtis, the guy who invited us and who had hit it off with my dad, Curtis was still busy taking cutlery from bags and peeling tinfoil off the trays warming on the stove. I watched him stealthily pull something from one of the bags and hide it behind his back, then step gingerly across the room wearing a Manitoban smile. "Hey, Dave," he said to grab my father's attention, "I've got a little surprise for you." I wondered how he could be so excited about giving a gift to someone he hardly knew. "Now I know you're a big Chardonnay guy," he said, "so I brought you something real special from my collection." From behind his back, he drew his finest bottle of Chardonnay and neatly flipped it around, resting it in the palm of his other hand for my father to scrutinize the label. "You're gonna love this one," Curtis said. Meanwhile, my mind was working hard, trying to reconstruct the sequence of events that could have led to this bizarre outcome. I had only ever known my father to touch white wine under duress. He claims that even a whiff of it gives him a hangover. He drinks almost exclusively Cabernet Sauvignon and is, of his own admission, hardly a connoisseur. I thought, where on earth could Curtis have got this idea that my father is a, quote, Chardonnay guy? The only possibility was that the topic of wine had somehow come up at Curtis's office after my father had arrived and I stepped outside to see Zoe off. It's another person. Other than those few minutes, Curtis and my father had never been together in my absence. Now I could almost hear my dad joking that what he needed was a glass of wine to offset the stimulant effects of all the 5-hour energy shots he'd imbibed driving across the country. Curtis, in order to advance the conversation, must have mentioned that he happened to be a wine lover himself and asked my dad whether he was particularly fond of any one variety. Do you like Pinot Grigio? Sauvignon Blanc? Chardonnay? He might have said, just to get the ball rolling. Again, I imagined my dad's voice. Chardonnay? Oh yeah, I love Chardonnay. Something about the floral bouquet, the semi-dry, semi-sweet je ne sais quoi. He would have been indulging in a trademark rhetorical habit of his that my brother Dave has long described disapprovingly as staking minor conversational gains on major practical risks. But now the chickens had finally come home to roost, and I intensely wished Dave could be there to see it unfolding. My father probably had no memory of his earlier conversation, and I could sense the desperation behind his smile as he showered profuse thanks on Curtis and Colleen. But in seconds, he had worked out an ingenious strategy. He swept up 5 of the plastic goblets that the cooks had brought for the occasion and set them out in a row. He pulled the cork and announced, "I think this calls for a toast." "It does indeed," shouted Colleen, Curtis's wife, from the far side of the cabin. "Glass of Chardonnay, Colleen?" my father asked, his voice rich with hope. "No, thank you, Dave," she replied. She stuffed her hand into a backpack and unsheathed a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon. I'm a Cabernet drinker myself. Anything white kills me. My father was almost sweating, and he knew that I knew it. He redoubled his efforts. "Chardonnay, anyone? I feel terrible keeping this whole bottle to myself. Anders?" He tried looking to me for succor. "No thanks," I said. "I think I'll stick to red tonight." Of course, I helped him to finish the white wine. Anyway, so that was the last night of the journey. This is a major spoiler alert, but it's hard for me not to tell you. The book has a happy ending, and after 5 years of separation, my wife and I got back together, and we are happily a couple again, married, and so it goes. So that's it. I'd be happy to take questions.
How did you know where you were going?
So at the time, Google Earth and Google Maps were new technologies, to me at least. So I had 2 things, really. I had digitized Canadian Geographical Survey maps, like old paper maps, but in digital form, hundreds of them. And so I basically would kind of go between those and using Google Earth to try to, I'd use them to look at the contours, the lay of the land. And then on Google Earth, I would look for, existing paths or things like that. And I patched together a route, and I stuck to it for the most part. A few things I had to change. In British Columbia, in particular, in the early months, I'd planned to ski on some lakes that weren't frozen yet. So I had to kind of rework my route to get around them. But no, I didn't have a phone. Oh, I didn't have a smartphone. Let's say I had a satellite phone. It was actually a bone of contention. I didn't want to bring any kind of phone or anything like that. My wife insisted on my taking it. So I saw it as this great compromise at the time, which of course is ridiculous, but it just shows you how kind of confused I was, let's say, at the time. So no, I didn't have regular. I could use the satellite phone, but I would have to, stop and charge it and turn it on and want to make a call. No one could reach me. Yes.
Did you keep track of your progress? In other words, did you strive for, or was there an average daily distance that you wanted to cover?
So Yeah, that's a good question. So again, when I planned it from the comfort of home, I didn't have an average daily distance, but I had sort of predetermined distances. Obviously, they were shorter and mountainous terrain, but I thought I'd be able to cover maybe 20 miles a day in most places. And sometimes I covered more than that. But I had some really unexpectedly short days, particularly in that first, sorry, I'm covering my mic. In that first section, I had a day where I covered about 2 miles, I think, just kind of just trudging up through really deep and wet snow. And yeah, I mean, I loosely kept track of the actual distances that I covered in my diary. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I have so many questions. But, I didn't want to monopolize that.
Yes?
What did you bring for food and drink?
All right, good question. So I had my one kind of big meal I knew would be supper when I got to my when I set up camp every night. So I had a lot of dehydrated. I spent about before I set out. I was coming directly from Italy, but I went from Italy to New Hampshire before going west, and I had a dehydrator that it was years old. That was still in my parents' basement, and so I pulled that thing out, and I just started dehydrating like ground beef and chicken and tuna fish. And then I bought lots of pasta and rice and carbohydrates, and sort of made these blends that some were more appetizing than others of things like that were supposed to be kind of like meals that you would actually eat in normal life, like tuna fish casserole or like pasta with like ragu or something like that. All dehydrated stuff. And most of them kind of worked. I tested some of them beforehand to see whether they were edible. So those were kind of my main meals. And then I had tons of dried fruit, granola bars, energy bars, that were kind of the food that I would eat while I was skiing along. I didn't stop for lunch, but I would just kind of eat that all the time as I was skiing. And drinks, I had, this was a very important part of it. Like I spent a couple of hours every evening melting snow and ice into water, and then I had this huge 64-ounce thermos that I would fill before setting off, and that was kind of my water to get me through the next 24 hours. And then I had all sorts of powdered things that I would add, like hot chocolate mix or like lemonade crystals, things like the sugary things that would give me lots of energy and cavities. So those were really the two things. I mean, those were the drinks, and the two things were like the energy bars and dried fruit and stuff like that I would eat basically as breakfast and then during the day, and then I would have the dehydrated meals at night. To boost the fat content, which is important, I would always carry a pound of butter around with me, and at every meal I would cut off like an inch of butter and drop it into my reconstituted dehydrated meal.
And how long were you gone?
It was 4 months altogether. Most of that was spent outside traveling. But the thing about, you meet people in these little places in this hostile climate, they tend to be very friendly, and you're very vulnerable, so you connect with people quickly. And so I was like, whenever I came to a town of any size, which was usually about once a week or so, I would almost always was invited home by some stranger that I met just like on the outskirts of town. So sometimes I spent a night or two. So it's not like I was 4 months uninterrupted sleeping outside my tent, but most of that time it was punctuated by visits with people, which is nice as an experience, but it's also an important part of the book because of the realizations. Because I become, like when I was talking about that black and white thinking habit, like everything Italian was bad and cities were bad and civilization was bad, and I wanted to be like off in the wild and so forth. I'd become kind of misanthropic. And so beginning with that meeting Nick and Mika, who I read about in that first reading, I started to gradually shift my view into a sort of a normal human outlook.
What about animals? Like wild animals?
Yeah, well, most animals are, you know, wiser than human beings, and so when it's cold, they go into hibernation, or at least, you know, don't spend a lot of time abroad in the cold. But nevertheless, I did see animals. I mentioned that fisher. Everyone, do you know what a fisher is? Like a fisher, what's called? Yeah, we call them fisher cats around here. You don't see them very often, so it's kind of a treat. I see lots of like snowshoe hares and things like that. Grouse, tons of grouse. And particularly in northeastern British Columbia, I saw like a really huge concentration of moose. One day in particular, I probably saw close to 30 moose in a single day. It's extremely unusual. No bears. They were hibernating, of course. The first week, like the part where I was walking inland, I expected that I might see some grizzlies because they don't really hibernate when it's not in that climate, that far northwestern climate. It's not cold enough. They kind of go into a semi-hibernation. Fortunately, I did not encounter any grizzlies.
What did you do to physically prepare yourself for this ordeal?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because it's like, I mean, you can stay in shape in a general sense of the word by hiking and things like that. But the thing about a journey that's meant to last an entire winter is it's preceded by summer and fall. You know, so it's not like you can ski in the months preceding the departure. So the winter beforehand, I spent a lot of time backcountry skiing in the Alps, and like most of my backcountry skiing had been like sort of descent oriented, like skiing up to then ski down. I started looking for places where I could go on tours, and I started using my skinnier like cross-country skis rather than my downhill backcountry skis. I did a lot of that, and I also spent a lot of time sleeping out in the cold with my summer sleeping bag. I was convinced that I had to sort of harden myself off and get used to the cold. Things like that. But otherwise, like as far as physical condition goes, I just spent a lot of time hiking basically in the summer and fall leading up to it, which is pretty normal for what it's my kind of normal life. But I was doing more of it than in the past.